Can you give me a top line spiel on the work that you do as it relates to SME lending? What needs to happen in Africa and emerging markets, particularly from a data perspective, in order for these types of opportunities to be realized?
Yeah, absolutely. When thinking about the data that's needed to actually assess the risk of lending for a larger loan, it's quite different than the data that you would need for consumer lending or working capital. And, a lot of the research shows that to really grow a business, you need large enough capital. For me, I think the most interesting space and the space that potentially offers the most impact is this SME lending space, but it's also the most complicated. And this is because you're not just assessing if the person is going to be able to repay a loan based off of their willingness to repay the loan, but you're also assessing, is their business actually going to grow and are they going to generate revenue so that they can repay the loan? You need more data, and often this data is not available. And so for me, a lot of my time is spent thinking about how do we generate that data, or how do we tap into alternative data streams that might be able to give us some insights into how a business is performing so that we can make better lending decisions.
Can we go in depth a little bit more on the types of data sources, how you go about actually aggregating the data, and then we'll move into afterwards, then what you do with all of the data in order to determine creditworthiness?
Sure. We're going to look at the transaction histories. We're going to tap into all the kind of alternative data streams that are out there. But then we also need to know about the history of the business. And in many developing countries, the history of the business is not systematically tracked. Some of the most important tools are on digitizing the histories of businesses when it comes to how they've performed over the years, including all of the details around their sales and expenses and inventory and how they calculate their metrics of success. And so a lot of the first order work, I think, is around digitizing this kind of information that can lead to better assessments on if the business can actually absorb this kind of financing. And then you can think about, how do we then digitize that decisioning to get to faster processes in the actual lending field? But if you don't have data to begin with, it's hard to start automating because you're starting from a place of not enough information.
Yeah, yeah. I'd love for you to talk a little bit about, let's assume that, data acquisition will get better over time. Then what happens thereafter, especially as it relates to making lending decisions and deploying capital?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think that I spend a lot of time thinking about credit decisioning. One thing that I'm constantly stressing in the work that I do is you need to not only build the models for lending decisioning, but you also need enough data to be coming in to train these models and see how they're performing. And this takes time unless you have incredible volume. And so I think it's really important to be thinking about the potential, but also the work that needs to go into making strong models that are not biased and are constantly being updated and managed appropriately. And this is possible with consumer lending because of the volume that's going through and the value of those loans. But when you get into SME lending, especially at the larger value loans, you're not going to see as many loans going through. So it's going to take longer to train those models. And it's a little bit more complicated because you're not just assessing if they repaid the loan simply because they had the money to repay the loan, but you also want to think about, like, did their business just have a really bad 6 months and maybe they really could repay the loan, but they went through kind of this, rough patch. It's more complicated than just, did you repay a $20 loan? It is definitely thinking about, how does a business ebb and flow, and how can you create a financial product and a model that reflects that life cycle? And I think for me, that's the most interesting space, but it's definitely a lot harder.